Okay, we're in Luke chapter 21, and we've now come to a discussion or thinking about the prophecy that Jesus gave. Now remember, the prophecy in Luke 21 was given in response to two direct questions. And those are in verse 7 of Luke 21. He's just told the people that the temple will be destroyed, which was undoubtedly a great shock to them. They thought he was the Messiah. They thought he would lead them to victory. They never expected that what was about to befall a few years later would ever happen. And so they ask him in verse 7, when shall these things be, and what's going to be the sign when these things come? And Jesus then responds with this prophecy. Now, since the temple was destroyed in 87, by the way, all that history last week, I didn't go through that to teach you a history lesson. I went through that because it's necessary to understand and know about that history in order to understand this prophecy. And I don't know about you, you may have known all that, but I didn't. Not until I had studied, not until I looked it up and investigated did I realize all that had happened that this prophecy is directed toward. So in any case, he starts then telling them what is going to happen. But we would expect, since the temple was destroyed a very long time ago, that most of what he is saying would have already happened. So he starts off saying in verse 8, take heed that ye be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near, go ye not therefore after them. Now, again, this happened. In fact, this has happened frequently in Jewish history, where people have appeared and claimed to be the Messiah. For example, if you look in Acts chapter 4, Gamaliel, who is still a renowned rabbi, a renowned teacher in the Jewish in Orthodox Judaism, says to the Sanhedrin, he mentions two specific names of people who came and attracted a following, at least in part because people thought they might be the Messiah, apparently. And so that had happened just in recent time when Acts was written in the early church. It's happened many times since, it happened many times before. The last person that I'm aware of that the Jews thought might be a Messiah was a renowned rabbi in New York City who some Orthodox Jews thought this man might be the Messiah. He died some time ago. He died when he was 90. He lived to be 99, and so they thought maybe this was him, but then he died, so they knew it wasn't him. So this business of being false messiahs is not a sign, not the sign that people are asking about, because there have been many false messiahs. There were false messiahs that came after Jesus' day and during Jesus' day and before the temple fell, and to this day they still exist in some ways. So that's not a sign. In verse 9, but when you hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. The end is not immediate. The end is not coming yet. He goes on, nation shall rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in many places, and famines and pestilences and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heavens. But before all these, so he tells them, here's things that are not signs. A war is coming, rumors of wars, tales of wars, natural disasters. These are not signs. These are not the signs you're looking for in terms of the destruction of the temple. Now, there are other places in the Bible where these things are used as signs. But in this case, he's saying these are not the signs you're looking for these are not the ones you asked me about. These are just going to happen. He says these things these things must first come to pass. And so, again, in our day, we can't look at natural disasters as necessarily being signs of Christ's coming. Although the Bible does talk about an unbelievable great earthquake that has nothing like it has ever occurred before that will be part of that time. But these things that he mentions, if you think about wars, in our day, we don't hear tales of wars, we see the videos. But in their day, a war would be there could be a war in some faraway place, and they would only hear rumors about it. My uncle's wife's second cousin's brother's sister, wife heard about this thing in Gaul or someplace. It would be that, because they didn't have the kind of, news saturation so on that we have. So they would hear rumors, and he says, don't worry, those are not the sign you're looking for. He goes on then and says, in verse 12, but before all of these, before this temple is destroyed, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up into the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, and shall turn to you for a testimony. He says you're going to be persecuted at every level, all the way up to kings and emperors. And that's exactly what happened. We have a record of much of that in Acts, of the persecution. As you remember, and this is important, in Acts, the early church, the main source of persecution was the Jews. It was not the Gentiles. Romans and Greeks didn't really care a whole lot, but the Jews were the ones that were hounding Paul. Paul, of course, is the person we have as an example, know the most about, but undoubtedly they probably treated other people the same way. It was the Jews that hounded Paul from city to city. Remember, the only reason Paul ended up in Roman hands to start with was because the Romans were trying to protect him from the Jews who wanted to kill him. He was a Roman citizen, so they were duty-bound to protect him from these vicious Jews who wanted to kill Paul and probably would have killed Paul if God had not used the Romans to intervene and protect him. So there was great persecution. But in verse 13 it says, "It shall turn to you for a testimony." That means it will become evidence. The word testimony there has the idea of evidence. The fact that you're being persecuted is evidence that you belong to me, is evidence that you are who you say you are and who I say you are. And then he says in verse 14, "Settle it therefore in your hearts, not to meditate before what you shall answer." Yeah, that's kind of a weird thing. He says, don't think about how you're going to address when you're tried, when you're brought before courts, you're brought before the synagogues, you're brought before the Sanhedrin, you're brought before kings, you're brought before. Don't think about what you're going to say. Don't lay out a speech. Don't plan what you're going to tell them. Don't practice your testimony. Rather, he says, "For I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which all your adversaries shall not be able to gainsay nor resist." Then he says, "And ye shall be betrayed." Again, he's warning these people that are, some of whom his apostles were there. There were probably other disciples that were true followers of him. He's warning them, these are things you should expect to have happen. And we know they happened because we have a record of it in Acts. Not to mention we have numerous historical records, but the record in Acts, remember, the book of Acts ends before the destruction of the temple. It ends somewhere around AD 60, give or take a few years. So that was years before the destruction of the temple. So we don't have any records of what happened, biblical records of what happened after that. As far as we know, all the books of the Bible, with the exception of Revelation, were written before the temple fell. So we don't know what happened to Christians in that era other than what we have as historical records, and they are very spotty and probably not all that reliable. So because the Bible ended its history in about AD 60. So he says, "Then ye shall be betrayed," verse 16, "both by kindred and by brethren, and kinfolks and friends, and some of you shall they cause be put to death, and ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake." He's telling them terrible times are going to come. Times when you're going to be persecuted and killed for my name's sake, and you're going to be betrayed by those that are the closest to you. But that's not the sign you're looking for. These things are going to happen, but that's not the sign you're looking for. That's not the indicator. He goes on and says in verse 18, he reassures them and says, "But there shall not a hair of your head perish." Not really. They take your life, but you're with me in heaven. You're in better shape than you were. You're in a far better place, in a far better condition than you were. So don't panic about these things. He said, don't panic about it and plan out what you're going to say, because I'll be in you. I will give you the words to say. And then he says, you're safe. I'm protecting you. Yes, you may die, but nonetheless, I protected you. And what really matters, you're fine. In fact, you're better off. He goes on and then says, "In patience, possess your souls." Be patient. Be faithful. Be obedient. Trust. And be patient. Even though you are beset by all kinds of trials and troubles. Yes, there are going to be natural disasters. There are going to be wars. There's going to be severe persecution. Some of you are going to die as a result of that persecution. But you relax. You're protected. You're taken care of. I've got you. And you need to be patient and just wait. So he goes through all of that with the idea that these are not the signs you're looking for. These things must needs be. These things are going to happen, and we know they did happen. Then he says, verse 20, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh," is close. So that's the sign you're looking for. When you see Jerusalem surrounded, I need to catch up here, then you know it's coming. Now, remember, we went through the history. That's exactly what happened. Remember, in AD 66, the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, was besieging it. But that siege was lifted for reasons that had nothing to do with the Jewish army in Jerusalem. It had to do with the fact that they had destroyed the Romans' baggage train. But that siege was lifted because they could not supply the troops in the field, and so they left. That was the sign. And remember, there were several years, several months between that sign and the actual destruction. So there was time for people to flee. Again, once the city was besieged, you couldn't get out of Jerusalem. That was the point of the siege. But once it was lifted, so Jesus says there's going to be this unusual, tells these people there's going to be this unusual event. You're going to see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. That's what you're looking for. When that happens, then you know the destruction is close. And then he goes on and says, and let them which are in Jerusalem flee to the mountains. And let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And he says, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein. Now, and remember, Josephus says that's exactly what happens. He said that the Jews ignored this, and that Jews from all over the world, the known Roman world, came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, and they got trapped by the second siege. So Jesus says, when you see this siege, now if you think about it, at the surface, that doesn't make sense. If the armies, and undoubtedly people would have thought, well, it's Roman, because that was the army. If the Roman armies surrounded the city, how are we going to get out? We can't flee. They're not going to let us out. If we try to get out, they're going to kill us. So how are we going to get out? So in terms of the people who heard this, understanding the details of what was going to happen, they couldn't. If the city is surrounded, how do we get out? We can't get out. But he's telling us to flee because he doesn't tell them, and they didn't know until it happened that first siege would be lifted and there would be time to escape. So again, they heard the prophecy, and Josephus tells us they believed it, and they did flee. Says the Christians fled, although many of the Jews did not. In fact, the Jews, according to Josephus, flocked to Jerusalem for the Passover and got trapped. So even though he doesn't explain how this is going to work, it happened exactly like he said, and there was time to flee, even though he doesn't explain it. And again, that impacts on our understanding of prophecy. He doesn't tell them everything. He doesn't say there's going to be a siege, and then the siege is going to be lifted, and when the siege is lifted, you flee. He doesn't say that. He says when you see the siege, that's the sign, and then you flee. And he doesn't explain to them how that's going to even be possible. He just says when that's the sign, and when you see that sign coming, you know it's nearby, get out of there. Now he goes on and he says, for these, this is verse 22, for these be the days of vengeance, that all the things which are written may be fulfilled. Now, why does he say these are the days of vengeance? What's being avenged? And I think there's some more history here that I need to tell you about. Remember this, God dearly loves his children. He says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Who were the people who were guilty of torturing and persecuting and murdering his children in that day, in AD 70, in that time? The Jews. God was avenged of the deaths of all of those believers who followed him. He avenged himself against those who persecuted them. That's number one. Number two, remember what the Jewish leaders said at the time that Pilate was trying Jesus. And Pilate washed his hands and said, I'm innocent of the blood of this man. Remember that? And what did they say? Let his blood be on us and our children. Be careful what you ask for, because they got exactly that. This happened in AD 70. The trial of Jesus was roughly 40 years earlier, so probably some of those people were still alive. Certainly their children were alive, and undoubtedly, because of the social structures and so on, their Pharisees and things, many of their children died in this siege, fought against the Romans in a futile, losing battle. And so their oath, if you want to call it that, was fulfilled literally. The blood of this man was on their heads, and God took it from them, took their own lives as vengeance. The other thing to remember is this. At the time in AD 70, historians tell us that the Jews were the majority of the population in that part of the country, what's now present-day Israel, in that area. They were the majority population. And though they were not technically self-governing because the Romans imposed the government on them, nonetheless, they owned the property, that they set the social structures, they set the economic structures, and so on. So they didn't have a nation in terms of being self-ruled, but they were there, and they occupied that land that had been given to them by God through Joshua many, many, many centuries before. Then there was the war of AD 66 to AD 70, in which many, many Jews perished, and the temple was destroyed. So the heart of their nation was demolished, because the temple was the heart of their nation. Although remember this, the Ark of the Covenant disappeared sometime probably around the time of the Babylonian war and the Babylonian captivity, and it was never restored. Now, if you think about that, that means that for over 500 years or so, the Jews could not conduct the most important of their feast ceremonies, the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest was required to go into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat. But there was no mercy seat. And so for hundreds of years, the Jews had been unable to follow the instructions they'd been given about what to do in the Day of Atonement, even with the temple there, because there was no Ark of the Covenant, there was no mercy seat. So in AD 70, all of that's taken away. The core of their nation's gone, the temple's gone. But they still live in the land, and they still occupy Jerusalem, and they still are the majority population there. Then in about AD 15, 16, 17, there was another revolt. Now, it didn't occur in Judea or Galilee. It occurred in other places. What happened, apparently, historians say, is that the emperor, and I believe it was Hadrian, was fighting wars to the east, and so there were fewer legions around, because they had gone east to fight the war, and so the Jews took advantage of this, and some of the provinces had an insurrection and killed apparently hundreds of thousands of Gentiles. Well, of course, the Romans didn't take that line down, so they came back in force and put down the rebellion, and it would not have involved Judea, really, except that the leaders of that rebellion fled to Judea to hide out, and so the Romans came looking for them. And, of course, at that point, as you can imagine, the Roman army's incensed, and they probably, chopped off heads and asked questions later, but they did capture the leaders of them. Then, in AD, let me get the time right, AD 132, there was another major rebellion led by a man named Simon Bar Kokhba, or some, I'm not sure how you say his name, Kokhba. If you can pronounce that, that's fantastic, but I don't think I can. He led a revolt. He claimed to be the Messiah. People believed he was. He led a revolt and was able to establish a nation ruled by the Jews for about 2 years. But then, of course, the Roman legions came and destroyed him. And at that point, the emperor made a decree that the Jews were not allowed to even enter Jerusalem except one day a year. They changed the name of the provinces. That's when it became known as Palestine. They took away Judea and Galilee because they wanted to try to marginalize the Jews, and so they renamed it. And that's where the name Palestine came from. It was not called Palestine when Jesus was there or when the apostles were there. It was not until 100 years later that it got the name Palestine, that it holds to this day to some extent. By that time now, the Jews had become a minority population. They no longer were the majority in the region that's now the nation of Israel. They were a minority, and most of them were scattered all over the Roman Empire. So they were completely marginalized. Now again, this is the hand of God in history. Think what had happened. The Jews were the primary persecutors of the early church. But within 70 years, from AD 70 to roughly AD 140, they became marginalized. They no longer had a nation. They no longer had an area of land they controlled. Their social structures were completely disrupted. Their religion was completely impossible to perform because there was no temple. They were barred from their capital city. They were completely marginalized. And the Jews have never been a threat to Christianity again. God, what happened was the Jews went down and Christianity came up. And God saw to it. Now again, and all this happened because the Jews kept picking fights that they could not win with the Romans. In every case, in some cases, the Romans overreacted to some extent. But nonetheless, all of these things it wasn't that the Romans got angry and decided to invade the Jewish nations. It was that the Jews started the wars, every one of them. And so because of their insistence on fighting wars against the Romans that they absolutely could not win, they ended up becoming what they were for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, until 1948. They were a marginalized people that really had their own internal social structures, but had very little influence on the nations in which they lived. They didn't have a land that they could call their own. There was an attempt to resettle Jerusalem in the 600s that then failed. Remember the Crusades. Remember, I know you weren't alive then. But the Crusades, they were not conducted against the Jews. They were conducted against the Muslims. So the Jews, for ever since the last of those three great wars, they never persecuted the church again, at least not very effectively and not very widespread. They were removed from the scene, basically. And those are God's chosen people. He did not exterminate them, but he certainly marginalized them. And for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they lived in other countries, subject to other people's laws, had no land of their own. You know the history, and were frequently the victims of persecution. Of course, the greatest persecution that we know of with the Jews was in World War II. And as you remember, I think it was in 2019 that I read that finally the global population of Jews had gotten back to the point where it was in 1938 or 39 when that persecution started. So many Jews were killed during World War II that it reduced their population and took them 2 generations to get back to where they were. So what happened was the hand of God. He's protecting his church. He's taking vengeance on the Jews. And what Jesus is describing in Luke 21 was just the first event. There were others that followed. But as a result of those events, the Jews became a marginalized people. They maintained the fact that they even exist is a miracle. It's only because God protected them and God preserved a remnant that they even exist today. Because think about it, how many other, there are many nations mentioned in the Bible that are completely gone. They don't exist at all, and none of the survivors, as far as we know, exist. But the Jews, we know good and well, exist. And so in 1948, of course, with the help of the Allies, they established their nation again. Now, we need to look then, let me see. Let me go on. And a few more verses here. Verse 22 then in Luke 21. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled, but woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck, those that are nursing babies, in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon the people, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, and time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And that's exactly what happened. Those verses literally came true. Now you notice, he tells them to flee. He doesn't tell them when. He just says, when you see this sign, and he doesn't explain how this is going to work, because again, if you're listening to him and you're sitting there listening to him, you're wondering, how do I get out of Jerusalem that's surrounded by the Roman army? But he tells them, flee and pray that that you're able to run fast and run far, because you're running for your lives. And that's exactly what happened. As we talked about last week, historians say hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of Jews died in AD 70, and historians said that's not part of the prophecy, but historians say that another several 100,000 were killed in the last of those great revolts, and many others, so he says, run for your lives. Now, we need to look at another prophecy in Zechariah 14. Zechariah is the next to the last book of the Old Testament. If you got it on your phones, it's probably just a matter of punching in the right keys. But if you're turning pages like me, now this is the prophecy. Now, as you read this prophecy, think about. You got to know that most of the Jews that were fighting against the Romans in 87 knew this prophecy. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the cities shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women raped. And half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Now that's the prophecy. Nations are going to rise against Jerusalem. They're going to destroy it. There's going to be a bloodbath. It says half of the city will go into slavery, into captivity, be taken away, but half of them will stay there. But now look at the next verse. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of the battle. It clearly says that there is coming a time when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. But God is going to step in and fight on their side. That's exactly what the people who were defending Jerusalem expected to have happen in AD 70. Josephus says that there were priests in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, fighting Gentiles in the Holy of Holies, and they were expecting that God was going to intervene because that's what this prophecy says. It says the city will be taken, half the people will be slowed into captivity, half of them will survive, and that was what was happening to them in AD 70. And they undoubtedly knew this prophecy because it's a great prophecy. The idea of the Lord fighting for you, what could be greater than that? They must have known this prophecy, and that's what they were expecting to have happen. And notice the prophecy says Jerusalem is essentially going to be defeated. It's going to be destroyed. All that goes with that's going to happen. The invading army is going to come in and take over, and there's going to be all sorts of atrocities and things. So Jerusalem is defeated, and then God's going to step in. And so here are these men in the temple itself fighting, tooth and nail with the Romans. They're half starved because they haven't had food for enough food for a long time. They're half starved. They're fighting Romans, and they are expecting that when this happens, God is going to step in because God is on their side and God is going to protect them. They were wrong about both of those things. God was not on their side, and God did not protect them, but there's coming a day when he will. It goes on and says in verse 3, "Then the Lord shall go forth and fight against these nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem to the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west." It's going to divide in two, some sort of earthquake or something. It doesn't describe how this is going to happen. It says it's going to happen. "And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall move toward the north and half toward the south." There's going to be an east to west rift. And the mountain's going to move. And there's going to be a huge valley where the Mount of Olives used to stand. "And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains. For the valley of the mountains shall reach into Azael. Yea, ye shall flee as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. And the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with him. It shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be," so on and so forth. Now, what Zechariah is telling us, if we understand it correctly, and it seems straightforward, that there's going to be another major attack on Jerusalem. Jerusalem's woes are not yet over. There's going to be another major attack. The city is going to be taken by a ravishing army, and when all hope is lost, God's going to step in. It says his feet are going to be on the Mount of Olives, which suggests there's going to be some sort of visible presence of God in this battle. That did not happen in AD 70, although they expected it to. It did not happen in AD, I think it was like 137 when Simon's revolt was put down. So Jesus' prophecy may have more than one fulfillment. It's been fulfilled in terms of AD 70. It happened exactly as he described it, and all the things that I've read to you have happened. I don't know if they're going to happen again or not, but we have this prophecy in Zechariah that says Jerusalem's woes are not over. There's going to be another huge battle in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's going to be taken. And at the last minute, God himself is going to step in, and is going to take vengeance against the nations that are attacking his chosen nation. When that's going to happen, the details leading up to it, there's some prophecies that are involved in that, but, just like Jesus didn't tell everything he knew when he prophesied to the people in the temple in Luke 21, so God has not told us everything that he knows about what's coming, but we know it's coming. Now, when we get to verse 25, back in Luke 21 now, we get back to verse 25, it appears that the sign, that Jesus changes. It says this, "And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken." Now, Josephus says that there were signs in the heavens. He says people saw chariots and things. Whether that's true or not, we have no way of knowing. Before the Jerusalem fell. This appears to be talking about something that has not yet happened. It says, men's hearts failing for fear. Well, I'm sure that men's hearts failed them for fear when the Romans attacked. I'd have been afraid. And I'm sure you would have been too, as an unarmed civilian. Even as an armed civilian, trying to withstand the onslaught of the Roman army, there's no way. That would be a frightening, very frightening thing. So I'm sure men's hearts failed for fear in AD when these attacks came. But then it says, and remember also that Revelation tells us that when people see the return of Christ, they're going to flee to the mountains, remember? And they're going to beg the mountains to fall on them, to hide them from the wrath of God. So there's coming a time when this is going to happen. When men I don't know what they're going to see exactly, but whatever it is going to be beyond frightening. It's going to drive people to attempted suicide. They're going to say, whatever they're going to see, they're saying, protect me from the wrath that's coming. I can't escape it. Fall on me, hide me. And then he says, then they shall see this, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Now, what are the powers of heaven? Well, the word powers is used in many different ways in the Bible. It's used of earthly kingdoms, of earthly kings. It's used of Satan and his kingdom. It's used of God and his kingdom. There are two obvious possibilities, both of which may be right, both of which may be wrong. One would be that the basic physical principles of physics, that what we understand of that and what holds the universe in place from our perspective, from a material perspective, are going to be altered by God, which he could do anytime he wants to. He's the one that invented them. He's the one that made them. He can change them. And so there's going to be unexplainable changes in the heavens. But he might also be talking about the principalities and powers. The spiritual powers in the heavens are going to be shaken. Because remember, Revelation says that Satan's going to be thrown out of heaven, for example. And so he may be talking about physical changes, but he might be talking about spiritual powers that in heaven that are going to be shaken by what's happening. So this is what he's describing then is not just, you see what's happening here. What he's describing is not just limited to the earth. He's talking about changes of some level, either spiritual or physical, I don't know which, in the created universe. Now remember, God created the universe that we live in, the material universe. But it's not all he created. There exists a spiritual, I don't know what you want to call it, dimension plane where he and the angels exist, because you can't get there from here except by dying. So this universe that he made, that he created, that he sustains, which is just one of his creations, and we don't know how many others there are, if there are any other than the spiritual plane, is going to be altered as when it comes time for the coming of the Lord. He says, and then they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now, who's the they? Who's the they? They shall see. Who are they? He's not talking about the people he's addressing. That would be you shall see. He says they. The people that are alive at that time are going to see something. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know what it's going to look like. But they're going to see, it says they're going to see him coming in a cloud with power and glory. And I suspect that's what's going to, when they see that, that's what's going to trigger their fear of the wrath of God that's described in Revelation. Notice it says coming in a cloud. Remember when he left? They're on the top of the Mount of Olives, and all of a sudden he starts heading up. Did he leave a vapor trail? I don't know. He starts heading up, and the disciples just stand there with their mouths open watching. And he says he went into a cloud. And what did the angels tell them? They said, what are you standing here looking at heaven for? That's what they said. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's not what he told you to do. He's going to come back in like manner. I think that means he's going, as it says here, he's coming back in a cloud, but not in a cloud that he just disappears. He's going to show up with great power and glory. I mean, it sounds like, and again, I can't be certain, it sounds like what's going to happen is the power of glory of God, which has been foretold and which has been viewed in some part by a few people. Think Moses on top of Mount Sinai. Think Isaiah in the temple when he saw the glory of God. Ezekiel, but it's going to be seen by the whole planet, apparently, by they, whoever they are. It's going to be witnessed, it's going to be made visible for the first time, probably since the Garden of Eden. It's going to be made visible, and it's going to be absolutely horrifying. It's going to be the most frightening thing people have ever seen. When was the last time you knew of somebody that fled to the mountains and asked them to follow them, to hide them? that when it is displayed, it is going to destroy man's pride in himself, people's pride in themselves. It's going to destroy their self-assurance. It's going to destroy their pride. It's going to devastate them to the point where they are desperate to escape. I don't know what that's going to look like or what that's going to be, but that's what it seems to say. So he says he's coming back in power and glory. And then in verse 20, when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Now he's not talking about their salvation when he talks about redemption. He's talking about your deliverance from persecution, your deliverance from the pains and agonies from the sin that so easily besets in this life. So it looks like, the verses 25 through 28 have not yet been fulfilled. They're not related directly to what the questions that he's asked. If you read Matthew 24 and Mark 13, you'll see that more of those passages appears to be things that have not yet happened. But he does say in verse 28, when these things come to pass, verse 28 appears to have a double fulfillment, because he's told the people already that when you see the armies surrounding, flee. In verse 28, when these things come to pass, lift up your heads. Now in verse 29, we're going to have to stop in just a second. We'll stop here. He gives them an example, a parable. He gives them an example. An example is, behold the fig tree and all the trees. And when they shoot forth, you see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. That's where we are. Trees are starting to bud, and we know that means spring's coming. And that's all he's saying. When you see a tree and it starts to put out leaves, and you know that's the sign that summer's coming, these are the signs you're looking for. Specifically, in terms of your question about the temple, you're looking for Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, but there are going to be other signs that come later that are going to tell you that are going to tell those that are alive about the coming of the Lord. I've heard people say many times, you may have too, the fig tree budded in 1948. I don't know. That was what now, 63 years ago? Is that right? 62 years ago? No, 72 years ago? 73 years ago? None of these things have happened that we were told were going to happen. So I don't know if that's, sometimes a fig tree is just a fig tree. It doesn't mean anything. It hasn't got any symbolism. And so in this case, maybe he was talking about the return of Israel to their nation, to their land, but it doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be just saying, look, these are signs. When you see these signs, when you see a tree starting to put out leaves, summer's coming. And when you see these signs I've told you about, it's coming. And the immediate concern to the people who were listening was, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, leave. Leave as fast as you can and go far away. And again, Josephus tells us that the Christians in Jerusalem believed that and did flee. And so they were not trapped when the Roman armies came back. But the Jews did not believe that, and in fact, they flocked to Jerusalem for the Passover, and as a result, they were trapped. And they died by the tens, probably hundreds of thousands in the battle, in the great battle for the city of Jerusalem. But that wasn't the end of it. It kept on going. We'll pick up then in verse 31 next week. The next chapter, and finish that, because there's warnings at the end of that apply to us as to how we should behave and what we should do. And then in verse 22, we start the account of the Lord's Supper, of the last Passover, really the last Passover, and all that goes with that, and we'll get into that. Father, we're thankful for the warnings you give. We understand that in the case that we just studied, you gave a warning to specific people about a specific event that would endanger their lives. But Father, you give us lots of warnings. Those warnings are for the most part related to spiritual things. We're to watch, we're to pray, we're to depend on you, we're to trust, we're to obey. Father, help us to heed those warnings. As you yourself said, fear not him that can kill you. Fear God. And Father, obedience to those warnings and taking those warnings seriously and living according to them is an illustration, or is an example, is evidence that we do fear God, that we know him and that we fear him. Not that we're afraid of him, but that we are in awe of him and that we believe him. Father, as the man prayed, as the man asked you many, many, many years ago, help our unbelief. Help us to be more trusting. Help teach us, Lord, to automatically trust you without question, without hesitation, without having to worry and fret about things before we finally come to the point and realize, oh, wait a minute, I can trust God. Help us to that be our first response, Father. We know that your Spirit leads us, and we thank you for that. We ask you, Father, that we would be attentive. We would pay attention to your Spirit. We ask you, Father, that as you have told us is your will, that we would be sanctified, that your Spirit would live through us, that other people who are watching might see you living through us. Father, again, we ask you, keep us physically safe if that be your will. Be with those that are suffering. Pray, Father, be your will that you would heal them and relieve them. But Father, above all, we know that you will accomplish your purpose. And we're grateful for that. And Father, as the disciples were told to do so many years ago, we pray that your kingdom will come and that your will be done. For yours is the power and the glory forever and ever. In Jesus' name, amen.